بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. اللهم لك الحمد حمد الشاكرين ولك الحمد حمد الذاكرين لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our sixth class of an introduction to Islamic law. Today we will be looking at some of the distinctions between the four major schools of Islamic law. And I have left everybody's mic on the ability, or actually, let me say that, to unmute yourself. So you do have the ability to unmute yourselves, or you can use the chat box. So we will go through about 3 case studies to highlight some of the examples that we are talking about and how some of these ideas create differences within the 4 schools. In our last week's topic, we spoke about the secondary sources of Islamic law. And we said, although they are termed as sources, they are tools, tools that you can use to understand or even sets of presumptions at times, but there are different ways that you can classify these sources or tools. The way that we did it was the agreed upon sources versus the disagreed upon sources based on the 4 schools of Islamic law, the Hanafi, the Maliki, the Shafi'i, and the Hanbali schools. Today, we will kind of be looking at the application of some of those sources and also in general. It's a very general, a very general class today in terms of how we will be looking at it. Let me preface today's class by saying that not everything that we will discuss is inclusive of every proof that is used by these schools to put forward their opinion. So we will be looking at some of the reasoning that these schools use, but let me kind of put that disclaimer out there that it is not that the proofs that we will look and read today are inclusive of everything that that school puts forward as a reasoning for their opinion. All right, let's begin by our screen share. Bismillah, just let me know when you can see it. The chat box is also open. All right, we're good to go. So distinctions between the 4 major schools, that's our topic. All right, so here are some of the reasons for differences. Let's take a look at this list. This is not an exhaustive list, so it's not talking about every single possibility of why there's a difference. Some of these things on this list can be categorized under each other pretty much. But just to give us a general idea, let's look at some of the reasons why there are differences between these schools and between scholars of Islamic law in general. Number 1, methods of interpretation or understanding. This in a general sense, the example of Hudaybiyah that we did, right? Let's recall that example, that in that case, you had 2 camps or 2 groups looking at the same statement, the same hadith, the same command in 2 very different ways. The first method was looking more at the letter of the law. The second method was looking at the spirit of the law. What is the meaning? What is the intended purpose behind that statement? So these are different methods of interpreting the hadith or the Quran or Islamic law in general. Now, obviously, we won't do an example from here because we took an example from here. Number 2, differences in legal principles. So this is referring to the fact that, if you remember last class, we spoke about those sources that are differed upon. Because these schools of laws have different sources that they are using, different preferences that they are using as tools to extract and understand Islamic law, the outcome will be different, right? So if I am, for example, if I'm employing sadd al-dhara'i as one of my legal tools, if you remember sadd al-dhara'i, it is blocking the means. So if I am employing that as a source or as a tool, I will be labeling things as impermissible, things that other schools might not label as impermissible because they don't recognize this source, this tool known as sadd al-dhara'i. So simply based off of the fact that there are different tools or sources that are being used by these schools, you will have different outcomes. That's pretty much an obvious statement when you just ponder and reflect over the differences that we went through last time, or the different sources that we went through last time. Same thing with the use of amal, right? The amal of Ahl Medina, the actions of the people of Medina, if I am employing that as a tool of extracting Islamic law, right? That if a hadith contradicts the amal, then I prefer the amal, right? That outcome that I arrive at will be different than somebody who is not recognizing amal as an appropriate tool of Islamic law. So number two is the differences in legal principles. Number three, the methodology related to hadith. This is one of the major differences between these schools. And this is also that difference that kind of, in a way, right, not fully, but in a way defines the two major camps, which is known as Ahl Ra'i and Ahl Hadith, in the traditional fiqh sense, not in the contemporary sense. So Ahl Ra'i are, quote unquote, the people of ijtihad, or the people of opinion, the people of Ra'i. And we said this is referring to a sound opinion. We spoke about this in one of the previous classes. Ahl Hadith are those that employ the letter of the law, or try to use hadith or give preference to that hadith over reasoning. Now, in a general sense, the methodology that relates to hadith, especially relating to khabr ahad or ahad hadith, makes a very big difference in terms of how these schools will bring about an outcome, or how they will view an ayah, or how they will view a hadith. Some things that fall under this is a hadith might not be available. So this is a reason that generally when somebody does not study Islamic law tends to give as a reason for why there's difference of opinion. They'll be like, the hadith didn't reach these scholars, or this hadith didn't or wasn't available in Kufa, or wasn't available in Baghdad, right? It is true that there are times where a hadith might not reach certain scholars, right? Without a doubt, that's obviously a possibility, and that's one of the reasons why there might be differences. However, that's not the underlying cause. That's not the major cause of why there's differences. That's one of many reasons, and it's not even a major reason. Many times you'll see the fuqaha, they'll discuss the opposition to a certain hadith. So it's not that the hadith didn't reach them, it's that hadith does not fit within the principles that they have established through their usul. So this idea that the hadith is not available is one of the major causes is incorrect. It is one of the causes, or one of the reasons why there might be differences, but it's not one of the major reasons. One hadith given preference over another when in conflict. So what do you do when there are two hadith that seem to be conflicting and you can't reconcile the two, right? And you end up preferring one for various other supporting reasons or supporting evidences that you use. So that could be a possibility when it comes to methodology relating to hadith. A third possibility could be methodology pertaining to ahad hadith. And this is one that we will focus on a little more. Number four, interpretation of words. There are multiple things that can fall under this. Two that I highlighted here are multiple meanings. So one word in Arabic can have multiple meanings. Which meaning do you use to understand that verse or understand that hadith? Right? If you choose one word or one meaning over the other, it can have drastically different outcomes. And we will actually look at one of the examples that falls under this category. The next one is literal versus figurative meanings. So do we take the literal understanding of that word? What if there are other reasons why we can't take it, right? So this is another one that we will look at examples. And then contradictory evidences, that there are evidences that seem to contradict. Which one do you prefer if there's a contradiction? This will go back to methodology. Like I said, some of these you can categorize them under other titles that you have on this page as well. It's not like this is the official set of reasons. And this is not an exhaustive list. So there are multiple other things, like one of the things off the top of my head are variations in qira'at. So if you know that there are multiple ways of reciting the Quran, like the Warsh style of reciting versus the Hafs style of reciting, sometimes these differences in qira'at can change slight meanings in the verse that can change the intended meaning of the ayah, possibly, and it can lead to a different outcome. Not as common, again, as some of these other reasonings, like methodology relating to hadith. That's probably one of the strongest reasonings that lead to these differences. Same thing with differences in legal principles. All right. What I want to do is very briefly talk about mutawatir and ahad. I know this came up once or twice previously, and we didn't cover it in detail because this is more so of a hadith related topic, but I feel that it is important for us to understand the differences between these two, at least with a bare minimum amount of knowledge regarding them, to fully understand some of the differences that come in fiqh. And this is also another reason why a person can't be a faqih, be a scholar of Islamic law, without understanding the sciences of hadith. They need to understand which hadith is mutawatir, which hadith is ahad. And yes, you can rely on the scholars of hadith, right? So you can use different scholars of hadith that say, okay, these scholars classify this hadith as ahad, or this hadith as mashhur, or this hadith as aziz. You can depend on that, but you need to have a decent amount of grounding in the sciences of hadith and in understanding the realm of hadith itself. So mutawatir versus ahad. A mutawatir hadith is a hadith that has been narrated by such a large number of people that there is no question of its authority. It is a definitive evidence, right? So this is qat'i, that's the Arabic term for it. Ahad hadith is the exact opposite. Anything that is not mutawatir is classified as ahad. So I want us to I'm going to show you some charts as well. I want us to think of ahad hadith. This is the technical definitions that I gave here. It's not the linguistic definitions because it's not really a word of fiqh that we're using. Rather, just understand the technical definition. So ahad is narrated by such a large amount of people that it's impossible to question its authority, or it's impossible to doubt its authority. There's so many people that heard this hadith that it will be impossible to say that all of these individuals from different places came together to agree to lying about this statement of the Prophet, right? And that number, about how many people it is, there are differences, right? So some people say it has to be 50. Some people say it has to be 20 people narrating it. Some people say it has to be 10 people. Like I said, the average lowest that you'll hear of is 10. That if it's under 10, it's not mutawatir. If it's 10 or above, it's mutawatir. So ahad hadith are those hadith that are not mutawatir. The definition is simple. It just reflects the opposite of mutawatir. Now, under ahad, there are different types. So ahad doesn't simply mean there's one chain. Rather, there's mashhur, if there's a minimum of 3 narrators at every level. There's aziz, a minimum of 2 narrators at every level. When we say every level, we're referring to the first 3-4 levels. So when we say narrators at every level, it's usually talking about the beginning levels. As we'll see, I'll show you some charts, inshallah. Al-Gharib is this solitary narration that we think of. So, those narrations that have one narrator at every level. So these are some charts from Sheikh Farhan Zubairi's Hadith Sciences book, or Hadith Studies, I believe it's called. I wrote at the bottom here. Hadith Studies, yes. This is an example of Gharib. So these are all 3 of these are ahad type of hadith. The first example here is that of a Gharib hadith. This has one chain. So the Prophet ﷺ, one person narrates from the Prophet ﷺ, then one person narrates from this person, then one person narrates from that person, and it keeps going down. Now, this chain is obviously ahad, but it's a very specific type of ahad known as gharib. Gharib means it's one at every level. And again, we're looking at the beginning levels, because after this, right, once it gets to Imam Bukhari, there's so many people narrating from Imam Bukhari, or from, even Imam Malik. There's multiple people narrating from Imam Malik after that. So we're mainly looking at the beginning of the chain. That is this, so many people narrating this chain in the very beginning that it's impossible to say that this is a lie. The next type is Aziz. Aziz has 2 independent chains, right? So there's 2 chains that are running simultaneously. Then you have Mashhur. Mashhur is minimum of 3, we said. So let me ask you a question. If a hadith has 7 people. Under the Prophet ﷺ, there's 7 people. Is that mutawatir or mashhur? You can talk, or you can type it in the chat. Mashhur, very good, right? So as long as it's under 10, and that's 10 by the minimum standards. Some people will not accept 10 as mutawatir. So now you can already imagine that mutawatir is established through so many independent chains that it's impossible to say that, number one, all of these companions came together to make a lie. We don't believe that no matter what. Then all of these people that are under the companions, they all got together. Then you have to remember these companions also spread out to different areas. So now you're saying the people from different areas traveled together or came to an understanding. We don't have email, cell phones, this sort of fast messaging services, right? So all of this, it makes it impossible for these people in different regions to convey the same message in this multitude amount of narrators, right? So that's a mutawatir. It's above these 3 categories. Now what that does is mutawatir gives us a qat'i ruling. So mutawatir type of a mutawatir type of transmission gives us a definitive proof, right? That this is the strongest level of proof that you have. If you remember, when we spoke about the Quran, we said that it is revealed mutawatiran. So the Quran classifies as mutawatir. Not all hadith are ahad, not all hadith are mutawatir. Hadith, some of them are mutawatir, some of them are ahad. So not all hadith are on the same level in terms of chains as the Quran, number one, and as other hadith, right? So this is just a very basic understanding of the division between mutawatir and ahad, or khabr ahad, also known as khabr wahid. These are all words for ahad. And as we said, ahad has multiple variations of what the possibilities are for a ahad narration. Some ahad narrations are stronger than others. For example, if a narration is mashhur, and let's say it has 7 or 8 or even 10, for those that don't recognize it as mutawatir, 10 different chains or 8 different chains, right? That's definitely stronger than a gharib narration, which only has 1 chain. All right. So let's look at some of the methodology for ahad hadith according to the 4 schools, right? According to the Hanafi school, a ahad hadith cannot contradict the Quran. It can't cancel a ruling of the Quran. It can't qualify a ruling of the Quran. It can't confine a ruling of the Quran. So they have, when they use the Quran, an ayah of the Quran, and you have a khabr ahad, I narrate a hadith, which is khabr ahad or khabr wahid, a ahad narration, right? I cannot use that narration to then confine something that's in the Quran, or change something that's in the Quran, or abrogate something that's in the Quran, right? So the Hanafi school in reality is basing it off of the power of the chains. How many chains are there as well, right? Now, the Hanafi school has about a dozen different other cases in which ahad will not be accepted. So let's look at some of them. Or this is the outcome. So if you can't reconcile the two, if you can't reconcile the Quran ayah and the khabr ahad, this hadith, this type of hadith, then the Quran will take precedence. Now, there are other conditions for accepting that ahad. If I narrate a hadith to you and it's khabr ahad or khabr wahid, to the Hanafi scholar, it has to meet a lot of conditions. Some of those conditions are it can't contradict ijma'. So not only can it not contradict Quran, it can't contradict ijma'. It can't contradict sunnah mutawatir. So a hadith or a sunnah, a prophetic practice that's established through mutawatir means, it can't contradict that either. It can't contradict the intellect. So if it's something that's khabr ahad and it drastically contradicts the intellect, right, it doesn't fit in, then they will not accept it. And again, there's debate within that, under that topic as well. It can't contradict the narrator's practice. So if the person narrating the hadith contradicts the practice, then we have to interpret it in a different way. It can't be a hadith that's discarded by the companion, right? So these are just some of them. This is not an exhaustive list again. There's about a dozen or more conditions that the Hanafis have in terms of accepting khabr ahad. right? Solitary narrations. Although it's used as solitary, remember, it has multiple variations. Khabr ahad as well. Actually, I'll get to this in a bit. Let's look at the Maliki school. In the Maliki school, we did this in our last class under the category of Amal of Ahl Medina, the practice of the people of Medina. So Khabr ahad cannot contradict the practice of the people of Medina. Does anybody know why the Malikis don't allow it to contradict the practice of the people of Medina? I mentioned this last time because the Malikis classify the practice of the people of Medina as a mutawatir practice, right? So the Malikis view Amal of Ahl Medina as something that's mutawatir because so many people in Medina are doing it that it's not narrated through one person. That's why when it has a conflict with the practice of the people of Medina, they give preference to the practice of the people of Medina. And we spoke about the 4 possible variations when a hadith conflicts with the Amal of Ahl Medina. Now, in the Maliki school, they have something similar to the Hanafis, where if it contradicts the Quran, they will run it by the Amal and other sources as well. Let's look at the Shafi'i school. When it comes to the Shafi'i school, they do not base it off of whether it is mutawatir versus ahad. So the Shafi'is base it off of the soundness of the chain. Remember, an ahad hadith can be categorized or classified as sahih or da'if or something in the middle like hasan, right? So these are classifications of ahad hadith. One classification of hadith in general is by the number of chains. Mutawatir has so many different chains. Ahad has a limited amount of chains. Another classification, usually specifically of khabr ahad, of all types of ahad, is whether the hadith is sound or not, whether it is acted upon or not. And the Shafi'i school established a system where they base it off of the soundness of the hadith itself. Is the hadith sahih? If it is sahih, it is able to confine the Quran. It is able to qualify something from the Quran. It is able to restrict something from the Quran. Right? So they are basing it off of whether it is sahih or whether it is da'if. Now, let's bring that same idea back to the Hanafi school. If a hadith is sahih and it contradicts the Quran, do you think that changes the outcome of this Hanafi principle that it cannot contradict the Quran, or it cannot qualify a statement of the Quran, or it cannot restrict a statement of the Quran? Feel free to unmute yourself and just answer as well. I think you should be able to. So the question is, the practice that we spoke about in the Shafi'i school, where we said the Shafi'is base it off of the soundness of the chain itself. Even if the chain has just one chain. Let's go back to this chart here. This gharib, right? If this chain here is sahih, if I grade the hadith as a sahih hadith, right? Let's say the hadith here is in Bukhari, right? So the hadith is sahih. This hadith can now confine something in the Quran. It can qualify something in the Quran, a ruling of the Quran. Now let's apply that same principle in the Hanafi school. If I took that sahih hadith, does that change this outcome that we spoke about in the Hanafi school of the Quran being confined or qualified by the sahih hadith? No, it doesn't, right? Correct. So those answers that are coming in are correct. All right, there's some questions coming in. That's actually a very good question. I will get to that at the end, inshallah. Okay. The Hanbali school, the principles of the Hanbali school generally are very similar to the Shafi'i school. So the Hanbali school will use that same idea in the Shafi'i school that we're basing it off of the sihha, the soundness of the hadith itself. Now, usually you'll find when you have the opinion of the Hanbali school, they'll say there's one opinion of Imam Ahmad that says this, there's one opinion that says that. That's because there's multiple narrations or at times multiple opinions coming from Imam Ahmad regarding that rule. So let's look at a case study. Bismillah. Combining the prayers or combining prayers, Jama'. And this specific case study is looking at the relationship between the Quran and Khabr Ahad or Ahad Hadith. Here is a hadith. Go ahead and read it. Take a minute. All right. So this hadith found in Bukhari and Muslim, amongst many other hadith as well, talks about the Prophet ﷺ combining the prayers, specifically Dhuhr and Asr prayer and Maghrib and Isha prayers. So the first narration, Ibn Umar reported the Prophet ﷺ combined يجمع بين المغرب والعشاء. He combined the Maghrib and the Isha prayers when he was on a journey. The second narration, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anh, states that the Prophet ﷺ combined the noon and afternoon prayers, meaning Dhuhr and Asr prayers, when he was on a journey, as well as combining the sunset and evening prayers, meaning Maghrib and Isha. So this is a hadith that talks about the Prophet ﷺ's actions of combining the prayer. So based off of this hadith, let's start engaging a little bit. Based off of this hadith, what do you think the ruling should be? This hadith is Khabr Ahad. There's a starting point. What do you think the ruling for combining prayer should be? Combine, not combine. This is a Sahih hadith. So the hadith is Sahih. And actually, before I put that ruling out to you, let's look at an injunction from the Quran, an ayah of the Quran. This ayah of the Quran, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتْ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا. So this ayah of the Quran, it says, indeed, prayer has been decreed upon the believers, a decree of specified time. Kitaban mawquta, specific times, right? These times are specified. So this is an ayah of the Quran. This ayah is Mutawatir. This ayah is stating that the prayers have been specified, very specific times for prayers. So this ayah, in light of the hadith that we read, what do you think the outcomes will be? Or to make the question even more precise, what do you think the outcomes will be based on the Hanafi principle, number one, and number two, based on the Shafi'i principles that we did? So let me specify that question again, or let me repeat that question again. We have this ayah, right? This tells us that prayer has very specific times. The second dalil, or the second proof, right, that we have is this ahad hadith, ahad narration, which is a sahih narration, which states that the Prophet ﷺ combined while he traveled. Now, in light of the verse and combining, right, in light of the verse that says specific times versus the hadith, khabr ahad, that says you can combine, meaning you can pray outside the specific times. So we said the Hanafis would do what? What do you think? I have some answers coming in. This is good. Hanafis, no combining allowed. Shafis, combining allowed. That's correct. Hanafis would say no because it's ahad. That's correct. Because Hanafi would go with the Quranic verse. That's correct. Right? So these answers are all correct. Here's your chart. In the Hanafi school, combining, not allowed. Maliki school, yes. Shafi'i school, yes. Hanbali school, yes. I want us to take the Hanafi ruling and the Shafi'i ruling, and let's jump back to this area. All right. Remember, we said the Hanafi principle was that if the Quran, or we said the Hanafi principle is in order for us to accept this ahad narration or any ahad narration, it cannot contradict the Quran. Contradicting the Quran means confining the Quran, changing a ruling of the Quran. So if I were to tell you, let me explain it in this way so we can understand the viewpoints as well, because the viewpoints is very beautiful as well. It's not that one way is correct or not, they're two different viewpoints. They're viewing this very differently. The Hanafis are saying that if it contradicts the Quran, if Khabr Ahad contradicts the Quran, we will take the ruling of the Quran. The Quran states that these prayer times have very specified times, specific times. If I told you, forget the rulings that we're discussing. If I told you, you cannot, or you have to pray between 1 and 3, this is what I told you. And another ruling that you hear is you can pray outside of 3. Is that second ruling, meaning past 3, is that second ruling changing the first ruling? You can answer with yes or no. Yes, right? That's how the Hanafis are viewing it. The Hanafis are viewing that second statement, which is the hadith, changing the ruling. Now, in order for that statement to change the ruling, it has to be the same level of strength. If I am going to establish a ruling that's mutawatir, it has so many different people narrating this, meaning the Quran, right? It's mutawatir. And you want to change that ruling, then it has to be at least to the same level. It has to be at least mutawatir. Now, the Shafi'is are viewing this very differently in a sense. Number one, their principle tells us, right, these are differences in principle. Number one, their principle tells us that we will just see if it's sahih. So the Quran is sahih. It's mutawatir, all of it. So it's sahih. This hadith is also sahih. Yes, it is khabr ahad, but that's irrelevant for this. They're saying that we base it off of whether it's sahih or not. If it's sahih, we will allow it to make an exception to the Quranic rule. So they're not viewing it as an abrogation. The Hanafis are saying if it's not strictly exactly how the Quran is saying it, you're changing it. You're giving me a different ruling. You're now saying, the ruling is you can the prayer has been for a specific time except when you're traveling. That's the new ruling. So you're changing it. That's the Hanafi viewpoint. The Shafi'i viewpoint is no, we're not changing it. We're making an exception to the ruling, right? So this is the two different viewpoints that you're having. Now, based off of their methodology with Qabr Ahad, you can see how there's two very different outcomes. Now, this is when a ruling is changing it. Sometimes a ruling, a hadith might not be changing a Quranic ayah or word, right? Sometimes it clarifies it. So if there's an ambiguous word, then you can use Qabr Ahad to clarify it as long as it's not changing or overturning the ruling, according to the Hanafis. So as we saw here through this first example, that based off of how these schools are interacting with hadith, although they're sahih, and the Quranic ayahs, their relationship with their methodology, of using the hadith versus the Quran, it will bring about different outcomes. So this is already a preliminary understanding that we can start with. Now let's go back here. This is the chart that I showed you in the very beginning. Right? One of the reasons for these differences is a word can have multiple meanings. So now we will look at a case study or an example that brings us a word that has multiple meanings. A case study of Quru. So this is an Arabic word, Quru, and it has multiple meanings in Arabic. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, وَالْمُطَلَّقَاتُ يَتَرَبَّصْنَ بِأَنفُسِهِنَّ ثَلَاثَةَ قُرُوء. And the divorced women, they shall wait or remain in waiting and do not marry for 3 time periods. So 3 time or periods of time, right? 3 time periods. Quru can mean a menstrual period, or it can mean the periods of purity between menstruation. So what's known as the time of tahur, or the purity periods, when you're not on your period. And this is obviously referring to women. So the Quranic ruling is this ayah, or this portion of this ayah that we are looking at in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 228. This is the injunction from the Quran. Now, the example that we're looking at is a word, this word here that's in yellow, or not yellow, it's like orangish, yellowish. That word gives us 2 possible meanings. It can either mean, and these possible meanings are the exact opposites. It can either mean the menstrual cycle itself, or it can mean the time period between them, the purity periods. All right. These different schools interpret this word in different ways. So the Hanafi school says it's the menstrual period itself. The Maliki school says it's the purity period, like the time frame between, right? The Shafi'i school, it's the purity period. The Hanbali school, there's a difference of opinion what exactly is their final outcome, but originally it said that Imam Ahmad's opinion was it was purity period, then later he changed it to the menses or the menstrual period. So this word quru can mean these two opposite things. It can mean either when a person is on their menstrual cycle or their menstrual period or the period after. Now, what implication does that have in terms of law? Let's take a look. So this is a chart. I don't want this to confuse you, but what we will do, we'll just walk through the possible or what outcome this will provide or what difference this will provide. The S stands for Shafi'i, the H stands for Hanafi, sorry. The Shafi'is, so this is when you're not on your menstrual cycle or when a woman is not on her menstrual cycle. This is the period of purity. So you're not on your menstrual cycle, then obviously this changes. Now you're on your period or menses, then purity, then you're on your menstrual cycle and keeps going like that. So the divorce is initiated here, right? Divorce can be initiated here or here, but obviously this is, not obviously, sorry, this is the sunnah method of doing divorce. So the divorce should initiate during a purity time period or time frame. So when a person is not on their menstrual cycle, that's when divorce should initiate. So not, it can initiate when they're on their menstrual cycle, but the sunnah method, the correct method is during this time. So we will start here, just to give you an idea. The Shafi'is, so let's say the divorce initiated. Because the Shafi'is, this is going to get a little confusing, might be less confusing for women, might be a little more confusing for men. The Shafi'is, right, so in both cases, we have a Hanafi and we have a Shafi'i. So we have Hanafi and Shafi'i. Ready? Stick with me. If it gets confusing or you're confused by anything, type it in the chat and I'll clarify it. You have a Hanafi, you have a Shafi'i. The divorce initiates during the purity time frame, right? This purity time frame, remember we said Quru, right? Is Quru, according to the Shafi'is, the purity time or the menses time? What's Quru according to the Shafi'is? You guys can type it or you can say it. What's Quru? Purity, right? So according to the Shafi'is, it's purity. So once the divorce is initiated, you're already in the purity period. So it counts. For the Shafi'is, it counts. And now we have how many periods here? One. Soon as that woman starts her cycle or her menstrual cycle, right? The Hanafis, that their first one begins. Because the Hanafis view the Quru as the menstrual cycle. So the Hanafis start their first one here. So the divorce is initiated, same time for both. However, the Shafis start here, the Hanafis start here because this is the Quru for the Hanafis, this is the Quru for the Shafi'is, right? I hope my mouse is moving along the words. So now Shafi'i 1, the second is going to be here for the Shafi'is, the third is going to be here. Once these three are completed, meaning at the end, right? Once this one begins here, once this menses begins here, right? The menstrual cycle, the divorce is finalized, this line here. So at the end of this purity cycle, because the Shafi'is say 3, Quru is 3 purity time frames, right? 3 times when she's not on her menstrual cycle. So the divorce is finalized here. The Hanafis say 3 menses. So 3 menses would be 1, 2, 3. So the divorce is finalized here, right? The divorce is finalized here. So this is an outcome in differences based off of how they are viewing the word. If they view the word as the purity time frame, or if they view it as the menses itself. Let's go back up here. Now, there are various other reasons why that support obviously both of their claims. So I will just very briefly give you an idea of what they're using to back it. So it's not that these two schools, the Hanafi and the Shafi'is, are just picking, Quru can mean both, let's pick this or let's pick that. It's very specific. So if you look here, this word here, thalatha, this word thalatha, this is the linguistic look at it. This word thalatha is feminine, meaning what follows it should be masculine. And when you interpret Quru as tahur, that's the masculine word that follows it. So the Shafi'is use that as one of their many reasonings. The Hanafis say this word here, thalatha, is a word that is khas. Now this is getting very legal, right? Khas, it means that it is a very specific word. Thalatha, right? Three. So let's go back here to show you, to give you an idea what it means by it. They said it's 3 quru. So it has to be 3. The ruling isn't 2.5, nor is it 3.5. So if it's more than 3, the woman's being oppressed. If it's less than 3, then the injunction of the Quran is not being completed. Now look here. When the divorce is initiated here, according to the Shafi'is, the first quru has already started. But the quru is not complete because there's days missing, however many days before the divorce initiated, right? If the divorce initiated 5 days into the purity period, it's not a complete period. Whereas the Hanafi say it has to be 3 completed periods. And because the divorce, the Sunnah divorce should start in purity, the only way that you would have 3 completed periods would be this, by choosing the menses period. You have 1 full complete block, 2 full complete blocks, 3 full complete blocks. Once you complete 3, it goes into, you completely act upon that Quranic injunction. Whereas if we were to start here and assuming that you're doing it according to the Sunnah, because if you start here, if you start in the menses period, if you initiate the divorce there, then obviously it will be 3.5 for the Hanafis as well. It will be over 3, but they say that that's not the standard practice of divorce. You should start where the standard practice is, where it's supposed to be. The divorce is supposed to initiate in the purity period. And that's based off of a hadith as well. So this one, if the Shafis, you got, let's say this is half, right? Then you have 1 complete one here and 2 complete ones. So you have 2.5. Say you weren't counting this first one. So you count this one as 1, this one as 2, and this one as 3. Now you have 3.5. So the Hanafis, they say the word thalatha is khas. Because it is khas, that's another usul aspect. Because it is khas, it has to be 3 precise. And that's why they rule that it is the menses that the word quru is indicating. Amongst many other things, like I said, these are not an exhaustive list of proofs. There are many hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha that speak about this word meaning purity or menses, sorry. So there's this back and forth that takes place. Both have very good legal reasoning. It's not that one legal reasoning is good, the other one is flawed, right? When if I were to give you all the Shafi'i proofs, by the end of it, you'll be like, this makes sense. I don't know why somebody else will stick with the other ones. Then as soon as you start rebutting those proofs with the Hanafi side of it, you'll be like, oh wait, this makes more sense, right? 3, not 3.5, not 2.5. Why would anybody choose the other one? So these legal reasonings that these scholars are using, they're not simplistic. They're very detailed. It's very thought through. It's not that they're choosing this over this simply because they didn't come across hadith, right? That's a very basic and incorrect understanding of a lot of these legal rulings that we have in Islamic law. All right, the last example that we will do today we're ending at 7:10 because we started at 6:10 inshallah. So we have one more example. So far you've been engaging good. Let's try to engage a little more during this. And I want us to, the way I laid this one out is I present one proof at a time and see if our opinions will change based off of what we are introduced to. So interpretation of words, we just did the multiple meanings, right? The word quru. Now let's look at literal versus figurative meanings. Case study of lamps. Interpretation of words, right? Now we're going to compare it. This is the ayah of the Quran. Oh ala safarin, oh ja'a. Obviously it doesn't start oh ala safarin. It's just the portion I cut out. أو على سفر أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء. So this word here is our focus. أو لامستم. لمس, if you look down here, or actually let's look at the translation that they give. This is, most of these translations are usually Sahih International. You have contacted women, and I erased something here for later on. You have contacted women. That's this word, lamastum. The literal meaning of lamasa is to touch, right? To touch something, skin to skin contact, touch. It can also mean sexual intercourse. So that can be the figurative meaning, right? But it's not the literal meaning of the word lamastum or lamasa. All right, let's look at how these schools understand this word. So according to the Hanafi school, this ayah, right, this word in this ayah specifically means or is referring to sexual intercourse. The Maliki school, it means touch, but qualified by pleasurable or sexual in nature. The Shafi'i school, touch, any skin-to-skin contact with opposite gender. Right? That's what the Shafi'is understand it as the literal understanding. The Hanbali school, touch, qualified, very similar to the Maliki school here, right? Obviously, there will be some nuances when you look into the Hanbali variations of the same ruling. So what they will qualify as a pleasurable touch and what will not. Okay. Before I do that, okay, let's do it this way. Which understanding do you think at this point, from what we have read, is correct or should be applied? And you can give a reasoning why as well. Again, feel free to unmute as well if that's easier, or you can just type it, whatever is easier for you. Which understanding and why? Hanbali, Maliki. And if you don't write your whole reasoning out, just think of it to yourself. So have a reasoning in mind. Obviously, this is not a class in person. It's a lot easier to engage with the class in person. So try to have a reasoning in mind. Hanafi. Any other thoughts? All right. Now let us look at Hanbali. Okay. Let us look at the full ayah. Right. This will possibly change our answer. Maybe, maybe not. So looking at the whole ayah, this starts. Let's. يا الذين آمنوا لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى حتى تعلموا ما تقولون ولا جنوبا. So this word here, I want us to focus on. Then coming back here, this is the area that we looked at before. أو لامستم. So this ayah is mentioning different things that will, possibly break your wudu, that causes you to, that you will have to renew your wudu. One of the things already mentioned in the ayah is in the state of janaba, wala junuba, that in the state of janaba. So why would the ayah repeat lamastum, right, here, if it's already talking about janazah? Because we know if you say this is sexual intercourse, right, janaba already puts you in that state that you need wudu. So why is there a repetition then? So now in the light of the full verse, the verse already addresses janaba, which happens after sexual intercourse. You're in the state of janaba, versus contacted women. Why would that be? This will be sexual intercourse and that will be sexual intercourse in the same verse. Like, why is there a repetition? Right? In light of this new evidence, not new, but the rest of the ayah, any changes of opinion that maybe this means something else? Right? So obviously, if you already chose the Maliki opinion, this could still fall into it. Very good, right? So one is sexual versus one is actual sexual intercourse versus pleasure or not intercourse. All right. Just interesting here, this is the part that I cut out in the previous translation, i.e. had sexual intercourse. So this is the Sahih International Translation. It seems like they mentioned the Hanafi opinion here for the interpretation, right? So the interpretation, la mastum, doesn't automatically mean this, but they give this as an example. So not necessarily promoting one opinion or another, but they're mentioning this understanding to clarify it to the reader. All right, let's look at this hadith. So now there's a hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha in which she says that the Prophet, she used to be sleeping in front of the Prophet ﷺ while the Prophet ﷺ was praying. So, okay, I'll get to that question as well. The ruling itself is not specific to the ruling itself is not specific to women. It's both ways. So, like the Shafi'i madhab, for example, says the Shafi'i madhab says that the opposite gender will break your wudu. Same thing with the Hanafi madhab. Any sexual intercourse will break both parties' wudu, and obviously will put you in a state of janaba as well. Here, let's look at this hadith. In this hadith, Aisha radiallahu anha, she's saying that she used to be sleeping or laying down, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he used to go into sajda, he would push her legs, right? Push them to the side, and she used to withdraw her legs. And then when he stood back up, when he's back in qiyam, she would stretch them out again, meaning that they were praying probably in a very small space. And when he's going to sajda, he needs that space, so he would kind of push her legs to the side. So this is skin to skin touch. And obviously the Prophet ﷺ is praying here. Now there's another hadith I'm going to introduce. Here is another hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. And again, these are not an exhaustive list of hadith. There are many hadith regarding these issues. So this is another hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha in which she said that the Prophet ﷺ used to kiss some of his wives before he left for prayer without renewing his wudu. So obviously she stated without renewing his wudu for a specific reason. Then Imam Tirmidhi mentions it is the opinion of Sufyan al-Thawri and the people of Kufa, right? Which madhab that we know is considered the people of Kufa or the Ahl Kufa, the madhab of Kufa, right? The Hanafi madhab. And the people of Kufa that there is no obligatory ablution after kissing. So this is Imam Tirmidhi mentioning that the people of Kufa had this opinion, right? Similar to what's mentioned in this hadith. So obviously it's not simply based off of this hadith, but these are proofs that are used to understand the words that are in the Quran. So that word can be interpreted as a literal interpretation, but then you have so many hadith that give us other meanings as well. We also have to understand there is a Quranic principle, usuli principle, that when you understand or interpret a word, you use the literal meaning first. You don't move to the majaz or to the figurative meaning until you can't reconcile the first meaning, or there are other supporting reasons that push us to that second or figurative meaning. So this is the last example that we will do, inshallah, or that we will do today. And that brings us to an end. We'll open it up for Q&A. I know there's some questions that are in already. I hope those case studies weren't confusing. I know the Quru issue can be confusing. What's interesting is the issue of Quru in many usul books is one of the first issues that are introduced to the students of usul. So one of the first issues that are brought up is this idea of Quru and how for example, in the Hanafi madhab, how the Hanafis use these principles of khas, right? Specific words like thalatha, the word three, to implement and understand the rulings from the Quran. All right, so let's open it up for Q&A. Go ahead, send your questions. You can also unmute.